Well, technically, we're 2 minutes early, but I'm going to go ahead and start our program. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, and welcome to all of you who are here physically and all of you who are watching online this evening and all of you who will watch this video in the future, no doubt for many, many years, as a historic moment for the Institute on Religion and Democracy, celebrating our 40th anniversary. And as a part of that, hosting our annual Diane Knippers Lecture, which honors our late and still much revered president, Diane Knippers, who joined our staff in 1982 and became president in 1993 and served wonderfully until her untimely death in 2005 from cancer. But she left a tremendous legacy, hence this lecture in her honor. And it's very appropriate that I note that her husband, Ed Knippers, the longtime first husband of the IRD, I'm glad is here with us. So thank you, Ed, as always, for all your support and encouragement across the years. And it is further appropriate that our speaker this evening is Dean Curry, longtime professor at Messiah College, and also very long time board member of the IRD. His memories are going to be autobiographical, he urged me to share with you. So keep that in mind. Dean's remarks are going to be 20 minutes promptly. So anyone who has to get their car by 7 p.m., you should have time to do so. But before Dean starts, we're going to have a few memories, 4.5 minutes worth of memories from Jim Robb, who is a current board member and who is a survivor of IRD's founding in 1981. His father, the evangelist Ed Robb, was one of the key founders, and Jim began as a very young man as the communications director, as I recall.
I was the only full-time employee.
Only full-time employee. So Jim, give us 4 minutes of memories.
I started with 5 minutes. You've got me to 4.5, and now 4. And as the usual introduction in Washington, you've taken up at least half the time, yourself. The IRD was different from day one because there had been conservative critics of mainline churches for a long time, but no one had ever managed to have a mainstream, respectable critique from the center of power where the media resided before IRD, at least in quite this way. That was the first thing. The second thing was the founders of Richard John Newhouse, Michael Novak, my father Ed Robb, help me out.
George Weigel eventually.
Galloway, Carl F.H. Henry. These were folks not to be trifled with. Very, very strong, every one of them. Dominating, I'd say domineering, some were domineering, dominating in their respective spheres. They all came together. And the real impetus was, were the mainline churches sympathetic to and aiding in various ways communist regimes, and were they truly the spiritual spokesman for their many millions of members, or were they something like fifth columnist? And so these very respectable men and women got together, came here, held a press conference. Lots of people came and said, there is a clear and present danger. It started a sequence of events for a time, especially in 1983, after my departure as a junior and only staff member. There was IRD became Flavor of the Month and was on all the TV news shows, every major news outlet, New York Times, Time Magazine, et cetera. And then most memorably on 60 Minutes, where Richard John Newhouse, in the little promo before their little click, 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 tick, 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 said about mainline church officials, they lie, they cheat. And remember that? How shocking it was? And it was the tables were turned. Turned out at that time, Reader's Digest had a major piece, that institutional media in America still was very suspicious of this left-leaning, politically motivated church leadership. And people like Morley Safer were very happy to take them down a notch. In fact, that 60 Minutes, I'm nearly done, that 60 Minutes was a double segment, one on the National Council of Churches and one on the World Council of Churches. It was the first double segment ever aired on 60 Minutes. And that, with all the other publicity that came out, all the other articles, et cetera, resulted really in the destruction of the National Council of Churches as an organization. It had, when IRD founded, about 500 employees at 475 Riverside Drive near Columbia University. And last I heard, it had about a dozen.
That's fewer staff than IRD.
Fewer staff than IRD. IRD is the chief reason for that, and it was easy to get rid of the National Council of Churches because churches, at least in the Methodist Church, presume other denominations were able to isolate that line item and not pay that without having to defund the rest of the denominational programs, and it happened really fast. And they had a fall, but. So that was the issue when the Cold War was still was not a memory, was very real, very present, and something was done about it. Since then, IRD has turned its attention to matters of faith and cultural upheaval, moral standards in the mainline churches, and including the Roman Catholic Church from the first. And it still provides a unique witness. There's never been anything like the IRD, and I'm not sure there ever will be. This is an organization that's was just like George Washington was the the vital man? No, the indispensable man. I think IRD has been the indispensable organization for church reform in this country since its founding 40 years ago. I've been thrilled to be a part of it for much of that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, so much. There's so much you could have told us had there been time, and hopefully you will at another venue, another time. Dean Curry, thank you so much for joining us. Dean will speak for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions, but we understand those of you who have to leave right before 7 for your parking garage deadline. So.
Thank you very much, Mark. It is a real pleasure to be here this evening. This is my first time back in the offices of the IRD since 2011, when I left the board. And it has been great seeing old friends. I'm not going to remember everybody here, so I apologize up front, but good to see, obviously, Mark, who I stay in regular contact with, and Jim, Paul Marshall. Wonderful to see Faith tonight as well. Jeff, Paul Stallsworth, who I haven't seen in many, many years. So again, it's wonderful to be here. And it is indeed an honor for me to be with you to deliver this year's Diane Knippers Memorial Lecture. And I am delighted that Ed Knippers is able to be here and share this occasion with us. Wonderful to see Ed as well. My relationship with Diane Knippers went back to the early days of the IRD, not quite as far back as Jim's, but through the years, I remember Diane not only, and I'll use today's lingua franca, I remember Diane not only as a major influencer, but I also remember Diane as a wonderful human being, and she was. In reflecting on her life and life's vocation, Alan Wisdom, who isn't with us this evening, but I'm sure many of you know, has said it well. And I quote, "She set an example of faithful Christian witness. She was firm in her conviction of God's truth, and that firmness enabled her to show a great serenity and warmth towards others," unquote. How true. And Diane remains deeply missed. Much of Diane's life her life's calling overlapped with the formation and maturation of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And she, as much, if not more than anyone, I would argue I would conclude, was responsible for the IRD's success. On this 40th anniversary of the IRD, I would like to reflect back on seminal episodes in the IRD's history, as well as remind us why the vision and mission set forth by the IRD's founders and those who have guided and served it since remain as vital today as it was 4 decades ago. As each of us know, throughout the past 40 years, the IRD has been accused of being a right-wing dupe, and worse, right? McCarthyite. In preparation for my remarks, I went back through a lot of media, and that was a common theme. However, what is striking about the IRD's founding is that so many of its founders had, can I say, impeccable liberal, even left-wing credentials. The individual whose initiative gave birth to the IRD, David Jessup, was a high-level AFL-CIO official. Jim mentioned David in his remarks. David had been a member of the Berkeley free speech movement while a 1960s Berkeley graduate student and a member of Social Democrats USA. Penn Kemble, the IRD's early organizational, financial, and leadership guru, was also a socialist of sorts, a founding member of the Coalition for Democratic Majority, and a speechwriter and close advisor to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. As an aside, for those of you who are looking for a writing project sometime in the next couple of years, there is a biography of Penn Kemble just waiting to be written. He was a really interesting guy. And of course, Richard John Newhouse and Michael Novak established their liberal left and even radical bona fides in the 1960s and 1970s civil rights and anti-Vietnam War peace movements. The IRD's first dedicated staff researcher, Carrie Patechak, who Jim and I were talking about earlier, was, as a university student, a member of the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. Well, I can't say for certain, and I don't know. I suspect that there may have been as many Democratic Party members among the IRD's early board as there were Republicans. Jim, you may have a sense of that, but given the backgrounds that I've just described, I think that may be true. But what united and brought together this diverse group of Christian educators and intellectuals was a shared understanding that the American Democratic Project was both a gift and a task, and this gift was in danger of being subverted with the help of some within the mainline American religious establishment. The April 1981 news release announcing the formation of the IRD, and I assume, Jim, you probably wrote that, That news release stated that the organization was founded, and I quote Jim here, to promote democratic values within mainline Christian churches. This was necessary, the news release went on to say, because of, and I quote again, the confusion in many of the mainline denominations, official agencies, and boards, which led to the funding and supporting of policy groups unsympathetic to democratic values. However, from its founding day, the IRD's foundational vision was not just to be another Washington-based political interest group. Indeed, the IRD's mission was rooted in the twofold conviction that the witness of the church was a necessary democratic anchor, and that the authentic witness of the church was possible only when grounded in dual affirmations. First, that Jesus Christ is Lord, and second, that the first political task of the church is to be the church. Protecting the witness of the church, therefore, involved the IRD in the task of church renewal. And while the IRD's original focus on renewal was targeted at the Protestant mainline or old line, the IRD's mission was always an ecumenical one, embracing evangelicals as well as Catholics, as evidenced by the early presence of two folks that Jim mentioned, Carl F.H. Henry on the evangelical side, and of course, Michael Novak. Defending democracy and church renewal were the centerpiece of the IRD's founding mission. The IRD's founders, and especially the influential trio of Newhouse, Novak, and Weigel, were confident that American churches had a key role to play in the defense of American democracy against late 20th century totalitarianism. Richard Newhouse, in the IRD's founding statement, Christianity and Democracy, if you've not read it, I encourage you to do so. It is still very relevant. Put it this way, and I will quote, "Communal allegiance to Christ and his kingdom is the indispensable check upon the pretensions of the modern state. Because Christ is Lord, Caesar is not Lord." I continue quoting. "While our first allegiance is to the community of faith and its mission in the world, Christians do not withdraw from participation in other communities. To the contrary, we are called to be leaven and light in movements of cultural, political, and economic change. History is the arena in which Christians exercise their discipleship. Because our hope is eternal and transcendent, Christians can participate in society without despair or delusion," unquote. While the IRD's mission was certainly shared by its founding board, no doubt about that, there is evidence of at least some early strategic disagreement. One original board member, for example, left the board because he wanted the IRD to model a more ironic Christian witness, while a majority of the board was comfortable, I might say, with the IRD raising its voice in the public square. My personal involvement with the Institute on Religion and Democracy began in the spring of 1983. After reading a Time magazine article describing the IRD-directed, and I quote from that article, counter-revolutionary civil war with the old line liberal Protestant churches. The previous couple of years had seen a transformation in my own political thinking. I won't say anything more about that. I would certainly put you to sleep. But I was drawn to the IRD's agenda after reading that Time article, as well as the IRD's David versus Goliath story. While established in 1991, it was, and Jim referenced this, a January 1983 Reader's Digest article and 60 Minutes segment that brought the IRD to national prominence. In March or April of 1983, I made contact, and I'm trying to search my memory, and I can't remember how I actually did so, but in either March or April of 1983, I made contact with the IRD and invited Ed Robb, Jim's dad, to Messiah College, where I was back then a young political science professor, to give a luncheon presentation to a small group of faculty. Memory is a funny thing. I still have a very clear recollection of that event. I still remember welcoming Ed and Diane, who accompanied Ed to Old Main, where this event took place on Messiah's campus. A few weeks later, after that, I reconnected with Diane in Pasadena, California, at the Church and Peacemaking in the Nuclear Age Conference. This May 1983 conference was arguably a signal event in the political reawakening of American evangelicalism, and it was beginning of my formal connection with the IRD. George Weigel and I were the same age, and we had similar interests, so Diane arranged a meeting for us at that conference. I met up with George in his hotel room. I still remember that vividly, and we got acquainted over some good Mexican food, and I'm sure, if you know George, at least 2 margaritas, but I can't confirm that either. I spent a good part of the summer of 1983 living in Washington while working on my first book, An Evangelical Response to the 1983 American Catholic Bishop's Pastoral Letter on War and Peace. Some of you may remember that. This book, too, was an outgrowth of the Pasadena Conference. For me, the summer of 1983 was a time of establishing professional and personal relationships that have lasted through the present. And a good chunk of my free time during that summer of 1983 was spent hanging out in the IRD offices with IRD staff. Sometime between 1983 and 1986, I don't know for sure, I joined the IRD Board of Advisors. As a contextual aside, for those of you who are tried to figure this out, probably under 55 or 60, okay? The decade of the 80s, as well as the 90s, were exhilarating and satisfying years for those committed to mainline Protestant renewal, the revival of an American evangelical public witness, and the emergence of a Catholic evangelical partnership. Through the mid-'80s, the IRD did not have a president. Little known fact. Rather, Penn Kemble, who I mentioned earlier, was the organization's de facto CEO. In 1986, Penn invited me to lunch here in Washington and asked if I would be interested in being the IRD's first president. I declined, but I recommended Kent Hill for the position. At the time, Kent was a Seattle Pacific University history professor. Kent and I had gotten to know each other while working on the National Association of Evangelicals Peace, Freedom, and Security Studies program, yet another child of the 1983 Pasadena conference that I've referenced. Parenthetically, George Weigel, who by this time, George and I have been in contact recently, George thinks he joined the board around 1985. George was also a consultant to the NAE's Peace, Freedom, and Security Studies program. Kent Hill was subsequently appointed IRD president and served in that role until 1992. His academic expertise in Russian affairs, Kent trained as a Russian historian, was well suited to addressing issues connected to the final years of Soviet communism. Diane succeeded Kent as IRD president in 1993, and as Mark mentioned, served as president until her passing in 2005. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, Diane's years as president became a time of adjustment and redefinition of the IRD's mission. Diane's passing left a major leadership void, as well as uncertainty in terms of the IRD's identity. The 25 years from the IRD's founding until 2005 had seen dramatic changes in American religious and political life. And to address these changes, the full IRD board held a 2-day retreat in May of 2005 at the U.S. Postal Retreat Center to discuss Diane's replacement as well as the future direction of the IRD. The U.S. Postal Retreat Center may not sound all that exciting, but it's actually quite a nice place. I don't know, so some of you are shaking your head. You know, you've been there. Among other things, the deliberation at the U.S. Postal Retreat Center resulted in the eventual appointment of Jim Tonkowich as IRD president in 2006. And following Jim's 3-year tenure, Mark Tooley, who had joined the IRD as United Methodist director in 1994, was named the IRD's 4th and obviously current president in 2009. At the invitation of Diane, I transitioned from the board of advisors to the board of directors sometime in the 1990s and retired from the board, as I mentioned at the top of my presentation, in the spring of 2011. And during that time, I served in numerous capacities, including board chair. I will go out on a limb here, okay? I will go out on a limb here and state that no nonprofit board in America has had a more illustrious and capable board membership than the IRD. And certainly this has been a major factor in the IRD's success. As a board member, and even before I joined the board, I considered it a great privilege to get to know and serve along individuals, and I'm going to forget some folks here, but individuals such as Richard Newhouse, Michael Novak, George Weigel, David Stanley, Carl Henry, Tom Oden, Ira Galloway, Mary Ellen Bork, John Boone, Helen Ray Stumbo, Terry Schlossberg, Graham Smith, and many others, including, if my count is correct, 6 current members of the IR board, and that would include Paul Marshall, who's with us this evening. But the IRD's success cannot be explained, I don't believe, solely in terms of its presidential and board leadership. For 40 years, the IRD has employed an extraordinary and dedicated staff of remarkable men and women. Besides the current staff, this legacy includes Carrie Patechek, who I mentioned, Alan Wisdom, Faith McDonald, Gerald Waltz, Walter Kansteiner, Lonnie Smith, Larry Adams, among others. The list of IRD interns has also been impressive, and at this point I will be shameless and mention just one, my former student, Amy Sherman. I know some of you may know Amy. Indeed, many of those associated with the IRD later moved into impressive careers elsewhere. Walter Kansteiner, and I don't know how many of you remember Walter, but Walter, for example, served as Assistant Secretary of State in the George W. Bush administration. And Kent Hill, of course, held high-level positions at World Vision, AID, the Temple Foundation, and other organizations too. Looking back over the past 40 years, the IRD has remained steadfast in engaging the vision of its original founders. But like all human enterprises, the IRD has encountered its share of bumps along the way. I won't talk about those. Nevertheless, there can be no doubt that the IRD remains as vital and relevant in 2021 as it was back in 1981. Throughout its history, the IRD has encountered external developments that disrupted and required a recalibration of its mission. The first disruption, which I referenced in the context of Diane's presidency, was the demise of Marxism-Leninism as a world historic force. As the IRD enters its 5th decade, I believe the IRD faces 2 contemporary disruptions, and here I would value the input of the current staff and board. But here are the 2 that I see. The first is the death, is that too strong of a word, of the renewal movements within the mainline denominations, with the exception, of course, of the United Methodist Church, okay, which may be moving towards schism. Because of this, the IRD has become more generically evangelical focused in recent years. As one who comes out of the evangelical subculture and background, unfortunately, I believe there is evidence that the boundaries of orthodoxy within American evangelicalism itself are becoming more porous. The question of whether American evangelicalism, broad generalization here, will remain a bearer, the bearer of Christian orthodoxy in the coming years is an open one. The second disruption that I would identify is the crisis of democracy associated with the national conversation about the end of liberalism. Many of you are familiar with this conversation. Recent years have seen those on both the right as well as the left attack the putative wreckage of liberal democracy, whether manifested in inequality, human deviance, unrestrained state power, and any other number of cultural, political, economic pathologies. In this regard, just last Thursday, and some of you who subscribe to Larry Sabato's newsletter may have seen this, but just last Thursday, the University of Virginia's Center for Politics released a very sobering and frankly depressing report that reveals how precarious and divided the divisions are within American democracy. However, as George Weigel reminds us, there is no plausible real-world alternative to the institutions of liberal democracy for those interested in a humane future. I want to read that again. There is no plausible real-world alternative to the institutions of liberal democracy for those interested in a humane future. Rather than dynamiting liberalism, to cite Barton Swaim's dramatic characterization, the project of democratic renewal requires the recovery of the preconditions of liberalism's success. Here's the good news. The good news is that since its founding, the IRD has been in the democracy and Christian renewal business and remains well positioned today to assist in the recovery of a democracy-sustaining political and religious culture. The work of the IRD is needed as much today as it was in 1981, and under Mark Tooley's leadership, and via its impressive array of publications and programs, the IRD is ready to meet the challenges of our particular historical moment. 15 years ago, exactly, on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the IRD, Richard Newhouse described the IRD, and I quote, as one small, significant Christian effort to retell the American story relative to God's providential purpose, and most specifically to God's creation of human beings wired for freedom, unquote. The history of the IRD has always been a story of David versus Goliath, and we all know how that story turned out. Thank you.